Okay, welcome. This actually is a microphone for the live stream slash YouTube video that Chris and the good people of Doudna are helping us with. So if this doesn't sound like it's making any noise, it's not supposed to make any noise for you. And later on, if we have we have a Q&A if we have one, and I think we will. I'll be coming around and you'll be confused because you'll be talking into this and it won't sound like it's making any noise because it's not, but it's just that you have to be loud enough for the rest of us to hear. Good acoustics in here. I think you can hear me okay, but he's mic'd. So, and he's about to come. First of all, the first people I have to thank, but I already thanked the good people of Doudna with Chris and Taylor and all the good people. I usually thank the people who are in the room. You, without you, we don't have an event. It's worthless. And thank you all for coming. It's great to see you all here, especially at such a busy time of year. Are you getting ready for the end of it all? I hope so. I want to thank, before I forget, and while I've got the image up here, I want to thank Alan Picaro for making another great poster for us. Alan Picaro of the art department. I usually do poster semiotics before an event. I'll keep it really at the bare minimum today. I do think, though, that it would be totally worth your time to come up or look at this, or look at the ones that are around in Doudna, come up to the center's door and take a look at this poster, and just spend a few contemplative moments looking at it and seeing all the details there. Alan came to my introduction to health and medical humanities class to talk about something called visual teaching strategies, something that's often being taught now in medical schools. And it was A, a fantastic class, B, I got some great papers from my students out of it. But one of the things he taught us how to do is just to sit in front of art and enjoy and just look at it. It's a good thing to do with other people. So if you want to have a little bit of a communal experience and then just look at it for a little while and then talk about what you see. It's an amazing experience about what we don't do when we go to museums, when we stand in front of paintings and taking the time to appreciate what's going on. I will point out that this is almost too good, but it's Emerson's memory and loss is so faintly there. It's almost perfect, isn't it? It's like to talk about what it means to lose memory. There's a lot of other details that you can enjoy, but I had to take the moment to say that because it looks like this lecture might be about Emerson's memory, which it, I guess, is in some ways, but it's also about the loss. Stop talking so much, CC. I'm CC Borum, the director of the Humanities Center. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for all the people in the dean's office, Dean Shelton, the good associate deans who are back here, both Mike and Chris, all the people who work up there. I do want to thank the good people of Redden who now, for 4 years in a row, have helped support the English research seminar, which the other person I need to thank here, of course, is Susie Park, who for 4 years in a row, first with Brian McGrath coming from Clemson University, then with Sean Salvant coming from Connecticut, then Michelle Faubert coming from Manitoba, and now Chris Hanlon coming from Arizona. We've covered the South, the East, the North, and the West. And so I guess we're going to have to go back to the South again next year. But she does this every year. It's a lot of work. Trust me, I live with her, I know. And without the support of a great department, all of you here, former chair Dana Ringette, current chair Angela Vieto, we wouldn't be able to make this happen. So that is the impetus behind a lot of this. I will let Susie take over. Who am I forgetting? Somebody else I should be remembering to thank? I will thank Chris Hanlon individually for coming. We're so excited that he's here.
Graduates.
You can thank the graduate school. Ryan Hendrickson, you're a great man. Yeah, I will thank you too. So afterwards, don't forget, I will be back with the microphone for Q&A later. In the meantime, let's hear it for Susie Park.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the Bazargan Graduate Lecture in English. Before we launch properly into lofty intellectual hijinks, I ask a very basic question. How are we able to gather together tonight? Is it the physical and mental stamina of our attendees, who after all braved the cold and the end of semester gauntlet of activities? Is it the rambunctious intellectual curiosity of scholars, students, and lifelong learners? Nay, my friends, the answer is crass. It's the money. More specifically, it's the things that money can buy and the overgenerosity of people who believe in the democratic power of educating the masses. There isn't a lot of money, so don't think that. Like support from the English department's most incredible Gene Toothman, the graduate school, and Dean Ryan Hendrickson, and the support of the English department, especially Chair Angela Vieto, and immediate past chair Dana Ringette. All of these entities put their full support into the great and capacious edifice that is education. This is the biggest home of all, one that has a welcome mat the size of all the Earth's oceans. Whoever denies the masses the great uplift of accessible and truly liberating education ought to feel small and alone indeed. I had to preach a little bit, sorry. A giant intellect and a rather tall fellow, Dr. Christopher Hanlon is now an associate professor of US literature at Arizona State University West and has published 2 glorious books, very highly reviewed and adored with Oxford University Press, America's England, and Emerson's Memory Loss. Dr. Hanlon was an was an English professor here at EIU and an English graduate studies director. Now, those of us who know Chris know that he has a reputation for bringing people together. He told me to say that, so. So it might surprise these Chris veterans that he writes so trenchantly and incisively about a famous writer's stubborn refusal to be the non-judgy, totally sympathetic, and frictionless friend that his good friend Margaret Fuller needed him to be. It's weird, I know, but it's as if Chris has some particular insight into Emerson's conversion, markedly away from holding an exacting and sometimes combative attitude towards friends. We had a fantastic conversation on campus about just this topic earlier today. While we thought out loud about the virtues and conflicts of different styles of friendship, some run cold, some run hot, and some run away, I remember Dr. Hanlon writing about the incredible sacrifices friends make simply in risking the act of building bridges between each other. Those bridges will sway in the wind and become weathered and worn through time, but the ghosts of those ties remain indelibly etched on the mind. Margaret Fuller, after Emerson and she had their massive falling out, wrote to Emerson about Emerson's little son, who would die very young, but they didn't know this yet, and who walked between the 2 estranged friends carrying a letter. And this is what Margaret Fuller writes. "Waldo has brought me your page. He looks so lovely, as if he were the living word, which should yet reveal to the world all that you do not feel ready to say. I can't go on past that image of a little boy who speaks when adults no longer can. Please welcome my friend, our friend, Dr. Christopher Hanlon."
I think I'm feeling a little verklempt, and I'm not sure I'll make it through this talk. And I just want to stand here all night and thank people rather than read anything about Emerson. But I won't do that. But I should point out, though, all joking aside, I not only study memory loss and write about memory loss, but I'm apparently a walking instance of memory loss. Thanks to CC and Susie for supplying me, since my arrival, 1 computer cord, 1 coat, 1 toothbrush, deodorant. Thank you, CC. Apparently I've never traveled before. But yes, and thank you to the people who paid for this and who invited me, the Redden Foundation, the English Department, the graduate school. And I also want to say, it was such a good feeling driving in on 16 last night. It's such a good feeling to be here right now when well, it looks like the money has started to come back, right? and with them the students and all the possibilities and so on. I'm so happy not only for Eastern but for Illinois for now having a governor who's going to subscribe to the novel idea that you should fund public higher education. And especially at Eastern, because Eastern has been one of the places in this state system where the humanities live. And the purest expression of that here, since in all my time at Eastern, has been the Center for the Humanities. It's a wonderful thing, and I'm so honored to be here, invited by the center, among others. And at the risk of going on, I also think happy days are clearly in store for the history department. We have a new chair there, Stacey Elder, and for the English department, my old friend Angela Vieto. It's going to be a lot of fun over the next few years watching the things that happen here. But of course, my chair is Dana Ringat, the aforementioned Dana Ringat. He hired me, so blame him. And you know, I guess it was like, what, 17 years ago, you and I had our first proper conversation at Rocks, and if I remember right, Dana, we talked about Emerson, right? Yeah. So I'm really thrilled to be here. And then I'm going to embarrass her because this is like the cherry on the cake. Is my old friend from Billerica, Massachusetts, as you know where I came from, Joanne Diaz, the wonderful poet at Illinois Wesleyan, drove down here to be with us tonight. And you've got to meet Joanne later on tonight. You've got to read her poetry and attend to her words. Anyway, so I'm thrilled with that. So I remember my colleagues at EIU with such fondness. And I will guess that some of them might remember me, not only as the founder of the Stephen Douglas Fan Club, but also someone who has occasionally been known to invoke the American 19th century essayist and poet Ralph Waldo Emerson. And actually, like many of you, especially many of you students who are here, I started off studying literature in a serious way because I became inspired by powerful language, and a lot of that language was Emerson's. Now, strangely, I grew up with Joanne right down the road from Emerson's home in Concord, Massachusetts, but I didn't know anything about him. I don't know if you got any Emerson in our high school, Joanne, but I didn't. I didn't know anything about him until I read his essay Nature in college, and I still remember that first encounter, the way you recall later on with a kind of uncanny recollection the moment you first crossed paths with someone who would prove to be so important to the shape of your life. So Emerson has always been my go-to writer, but I want to talk especially to the students who are here about how Emerson eventually sort of changed for me. I wrote a book about 5 years ago about England and America in the 19th century, and Emerson figured prominently in that book. So I found myself at a certain point visiting the Emerson Family Memorial Deposit, which is this incredible trove, mainly of handwritten documents by Emerson and others close to him, and it's housed at Harvard University. Now, I was doing other things in that archive at that time, but while nosing around there, I came across a document I want to show you now, if I can work this. Oops, I should have had that up. Resolution isn't great, but I'll be zooming in a moment. Let me give you some information about this page. It's part of a letter written by James Elliott Cabot, who was Emerson's literary executor, and who is addressing here Emerson's daughter, Ellen Tucker Emerson. Now, Emerson had died the prior year in 1882, and Cabot was in the process of compiling what would become the first standard edition of Emerson's works, the complete works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, as it would come to be titled. Now, complete works, by the way, is always a misnomer. Because they're never anything nearly approaching complete, but rather are the expression of an editor's notion of what matters, what should be read and remembered, what texts really define who a writer was, of which more later. But Cabot's edition of Emerson, the first standard edition of Emerson, was certainly just such an editor's concoction, and it would appear also have been Ellen Tucker Emerson's, because here he is writing to her, asking her what he thinks of his plan, what she thinks of his plans. Now, a couple of things I want to point out to you about this page from Cabot's letter. Those of you who know Emerson, here in what Cabot projects as the 11th volume of what would be a 12-volume set, notice that Cabot imagines a grouping of essays, right here, to be titled Essays Third Series. Now, that's a title that would implicitly afford this arrangement of texts a kind of standing alongside the tremendously important Essays Series 1 and Essays Series 2, which Emerson himself published during the 1840s. So that means that texts that barely anyone reads now, like Milton or Agriculture in Massachusetts, would be placed alongside Self-Reliance, Experience, The Poet, or indeed the text we discussed this afternoon, Friendship. Now, Cabot never actually executed that grouping under the title Third Series, by the way. And there's no way of knowing whether that's because he had second thoughts himself or because Ellen told him that she thought it was a bad idea or something like that. But the other thing I want to point out, though, is that if you look up the page up here to the grouping Cabot calls miscellanies, and this grouping he did publish in the complete works, he lists Emerson's stirring lecture right here, The Fortune of the Republic. Now, I'm not going to offer anything like a reading today of that lecture, but I do want to mention to you that this text has become really, really important to readers of Emerson today. Emerson first gave the talk in 1863, and the lecture asks all these important questions about what kind of country we're going to have once the Civil War ends. It's an idealistic lecture. It's a lecture to challenge its audience to think hard about what kind of democracy we want, why fighting the war matters. Spoiler, it matters because it was about slavery, ending slavery. The brilliant reader of Emerson, Len Gauguin, who has done more than anyone to get us to recognize what a powerful abolitionist Emerson eventually became, calls this lecture an instance of transcendental warfare. And according to this document, this letter from Cabot to Ellen, the lecture isn't actually Emerson's alone. Because there, next to the title, Cabot inserts a note, or really kind of a query to Ellen. This was put together by us, he writes. Out of what materials? So I had sort of a WTF moment in the library at Harvard when I came across this. And that feeling of disorientation is only amplified at other spots on the page, where Cabot again distinguishes texts that I have read and written about and taught as Emerson's texts that were, he says, put together by us. So you can imagine I found myself thinking, well, what exactly does that phrase mean, put together by us? Because in some sense, that's what editors do, right? They put things together. They arrange text, they make corrections, they get under the hood, and they mess with things. Even when Cabot describes other texts in this projected volume of his as if to be printed in original form, that doesn't necessarily amount to some kind of admission of plagiarism, except for that question he asks Ellen, out of what materials? So whatever else he's asking Ellen to recollect, Cabot is saying not only that Fortune of the Republic did not at this time exist in a rendition Emerson wrote and whose publication he oversaw, but that the text now extant was put together by other people who at the moment of publication couldn't recollect the manuscript materials from which they claimed to have derived the text. Now the editor and textual theorist John Bryant urges us to consider literary text to be what he calls fluid. And by that he means to point out that when we pick up a published text, rather than say a handwritten manuscript, what we are reading is very rarely the product of a single authoritative mind operating in isolation. But in the instance of Cabot, Ellen Tucker Emerson, and Emerson himself, Bryant's idea becomes sort of vexed or multi-layered by the circumstance from which I draw the title of my talk tonight, Emerson's Memory Loss. I'll explain why in a moment. But first I want to point out that there is a surfeit of contemporary commentary concerning Emerson's increasingly impaired state from about the mid-1860s until his death in 1862. One such commentary comes from Ellen Tucker Emerson herself, who after Emerson's death recollected for Cabot, who was then writing a family-authorized first biography of Emerson. She recollected a portrait of Emerson on the night his house in Concord burned in 1872. While his neighbors struggled to rescue papers, books, and furniture from the burning two-story house, Emerson, according to Ellen, I'm going to use air quotes tonight because it's easy for me, he deliberately flung other belongings into the inferno, specifically mementos of his first wife, Ellen Tucker, who had died of tuberculosis slightly more than 40 years before in 1831, and of his first son, Waldo, who Susie just mentioned a moment ago, who had succumbed to scarlatina 11 years after that in 1842. Now, Cabot would omit that portrait from the biography he wrote when he published it as the title was The Memoirs of Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1887. Moreover, Ellen herself was not present at the fire. Her report to Cabot seems to have come about from another account written by Anna Alcott Pratt, who was present and who describes, I quote, "The poet of America wandering forlornly about in an old muddy coat and no stockings, smiling serenely if anyone spoke to him, and looking calmly on the wreck of his home as if it were of no special consequence to him." So now we've got a quorum of recollectors here, Alcott Pratt as eyewitness, Ellen Tucker Emerson as the conduit of her report, Cabot eliciting the account but deciding, perhaps advisedly, to let it slip his mind. But many others did not similarly repress the obviousness of Emerson's impairment during this period. Alcott Pratt's portrait of him at the fire, disoriented, unfazed by the loss of his underinsured home and the library and the office where he had penned most of his oeuvre, resonates with so many other reports. The serene smile, the calm look, the air of disconnection. These are the signature descriptors marking so many depictions of Emerson during roughly the last decade and a half of his life. Though often these reports are delivered euphemistically. In his eulogy of Emerson, written in 1882, Whitman describes Emerson's remoteness as the indicator of his vitality, wondering, and again I quote, "How shall I henceforth dwell on the blessed hours when I saw that benignant face, the clear eyes, the silently smiling mouth, the form yet upright in its great age, and such an absence of decrepitude?" In fact, during the period to which Whitman refers, Emerson was mostly unable to speak. Though, again, before his aphasia became so absolute, Emerson's increasingly disconnected air prompted others to explain away his distance as some kind of transcendental reverie. In 1874, a journalist writing for Frank Leslie's Illustrated claimed that, quote, "There is an awful distance in his impersonal gray eyes, and the man seems at times as if changed to a far-off, cold, intellectual iceberg," unquote. Writing for the Century Illustrated just after Emerson's death, Emma Lazarus described, quote, "the benign expression of smiling wisdom, which in his old age transfigured his naturally rugged features." Another correspondent, writing for the Chicago Tribune, assessed Emerson's mute, distracted presence at Alcott's Concord School in 1880 in this way, quote, "The lips of the Sphinx are sealed, and their private expression and the faraway look in the eyes would seem to indicate that the discussion going on has not sufficient interest to draw him from the calm joy of reverie." Now, I'm going to circle back eventually to the questions with which I've started tonight, questions concerning Emerson's authorship of texts like The Fortune of the Republic. But before that, I want to ask, along what continuum does transcendental bliss verge onto something more blank, something revealing the very debility by which Whitman insisted Emerson had remained untouched? In a detailed account of Emerson's physical and mental state provided to Dr. Edward Clark the September following the blaze in 1870, Ellen Tucker Emerson reported, "He used to be remarkable for never forgetting," lost my place. "He used to be remarkable for never, sorry, I forget where I am. For never forgetting errands, etc. It must be 5 or 6 years since that faculty failed, and now for as much as 3 years, he's been unable to remember when he was asked to do things. By 1872, he was unable to edit his own work," Ellen makes clear. "I just took his proofs to read for him," she wrote her sister Edith that year. He said, quote, "I get an impression in reading them they talk too much about the same thing, but I cannot find out." To prevent Emerson from embarrassing himself in public, Ellen was constantly at her father's side during speaking engagements over much of the 1870s. Oliver Wendell Holmes, sounding the euphemistic rhetoric characterizing most Emerson biographies since, noted in 1884 Emerson's caretaking at these events, even as he obscured its nature. In his account, and this quote is really difficult to follow, his sort of rhetoric is so labyrinthine here, so forgive me for that, but he says, "Ellen followed him with assiduous, quiet, ever-watchful care. And what were her frequent interjections but merely an echo before the words whose voice it was to shape for him when his mind faltered and needed a momentary impulse?" The poem's really kind of bending over backward, I think, to sort of explain it away in some sense. Holmes's reminiscence was less succinct than a few other eyewitness reports, including an account published in the Massachusetts Plowman, which found one of Emerson's lectures in 1879, quote, "sadly interrupted by the inroads of old age," even while noting, quote, "it took 2 instead of 1 to read." And on this page, from his interview notes dated 1882, Cabot reports that Ellen professed having sat in terror as her father read publicly in 1872, realizing even at this point that, quote, his memory, you can kind of see it there, his memory is entirely gone. So Ellen's account of Emerson's unhinged behavior the night his house burned is jarring, but not because Emerson scholars have been honestly unaware that during the last decade of his life, Emerson probably had Alzheimer's disease. Anecdotal evidence of Emerson's senility jars the tradition of Emerson biography through which it somehow still travels. It unsettles the tacit agreement among so many of his biographers that the available facts concerning Emerson's derangement in late life shall not be addressed in a plain-spoken way. During the last decade of his life, we're continually informed, and these are quotes from his major 20th century biographers. Emerson's powers were beginning to fail. He sometimes stumbled a little over some of his words. His powers and energies declined. In his last years, he drifted into his twilight. Emerson was experiencing difficulty with his memory. According to Stephen Witcher, quote, age came gently to Emerson, unquote, whose poem Terminus and its resolution that it is time to be old serve as confirmation for Witcher of Emerson's dignified descent unto death. The scholarship of John McAleer transmits a most unusually stark report of Emerson's senility, even as it embeds the evidence in the most tortuously constructed denials of its meaning. Edward Bach, an admirer of Emerson's, who gained an audience through Louisa May Alcott, describes in one primary document an Emerson who forgets that there are people in the room the moment he turns his back, who forgets Alcott's identity, who believed that Thomas Carlyle, who lived in Scotland, had visited only that morning and would return the next day, and who brings the attenuated Ellen to tears through these lapses in the eradicated histories they signify. But rather than taking up the cue in order to investigate in a serious way Emerson's state, McAleer turns upon Bach himself, a working-class young man from New York whom McAleer calls uneducated, whom he describes as a gauche, opportunistic tourist for having carried an autograph book, whom he faults indeed for having, and I quote, failed to realize that he had been privy to that rarest of mortal transfigurations, a vision of Emerson dwelling in the land of the ideal. Van Wyck Brooks, writing in 1932, offers a panegyric to Emerson's final decade. He tells us that though, quote, for some time his memory had been hiding itself, though Emerson first lost proper names and then common words, these unmistakable signs of neurological decline become for Brooks the evidence of Emerson's personal sublimation. Within, he somehow knows, Emerson felt no change, since age could never alter his own happy temper. But gradually, Brooks explains, year by year, the outline had grown indistinct and the halo gayer and brighter, till at last there was left only a sense of presence. So it's respect to such euphemistic language that I think Ellen's account of Emerson's behavior the night his Concord house burned jolts the polite codes into which the issue of his memory loss had been repressed. For there is Emerson, hurling into the flames of his burning home the material remnants of his first marriage to Ellen Tucker, observed, if only in her mind's eye, by the daughter who after all incarnates his memory of that marriage. Like all namesakes, a word made flesh, Ellen Tucker Emerson. Had he not asked in self-reliance, why drag this corpse of your memory? In the first series of essays, Emerson had put the question rhetorically as a way of prompting his reader toward a living in the moment without regard for the past. And yet, by the time he published Self-Reliance in his 38th year, and 10 years after his first wife's death by tuberculosis, Emerson had already begun to accumulate corpses, either to remember or not. Surely the metaphor from Self-Reliance relays the cadaverous dimension of memory, for the word remember implies a project involving a corpse, a reassembly, a remembering, and in that end signifies a restoration of bodies, the return of a touch we crave so greatly as to fear our own wanting. There would be more corpses than Ellen Tucker's, either to drag behind him or not, including his brothers, who had also succumbed to tuberculosis, including Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, and also, most famously, most productively and lyrically treated by Emerson's best readers, the corpse of his 5-year-old son, Waldo, whom Emerson would remember in the essay Experience, even while refusing to use his name. In the death of my son, now more than 2 years ago, he writes there. In a way that is remindful of Stanley Cavell's marvelous reading of Emerson's conception of incessantly turning away, which, as Cavell points out, entails a just as incessant turning toward. Emerson incessantly remembered his corpses, as when he peered into Waldo's casket upon its removal to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in 1857, 15 years after the boy's death, as he had similarly looked into Ellen Tucker's crypt 25 years earlier in 1832, only a few months after hers. Even as when, in 1882, his memory having long evaded him, Emerson remembered Waldo to the last, as reportedly he muttered from his deathbed, "Oh, that beautiful boy." I should back up a moment to confess that my main purpose over the past years has not really been to call down the often euphemistic, prosaic rhetoric surrounding Emerson's dementia, though these platitudinous codes for Emerson's memory loss have created difficulties for his serious readers over the past century and a half. And if I sound somewhat strident as I describe that tradition of evasion, it's also true that I should consider that such strategies of denial are not so different from those that can form within families who lose kin to profound memory loss. Certainly, there is in the scholarly history I describe something of the same unspoken pact of protective benevolence. But I think the tendency to gloss over Emerson's final decade exacts a cost, and one of these is to obscure from view the fact that even as Emerson's memory was beginning to erode, Emerson was writing an awful lot about memory. In fact, the lecture series Emerson delivered at Harvard in 1870 and then again in 1871, a series he entitled Natural History of the Intellect, far from a minor note in Emerson's total output, is a piece of oratory Emerson had hoped would form a culmination of his career. And indeed, the lecture from that series entitled Memory, Emerson continued to develop well after he was able to lecture on his own. With Ellen at his side, Emerson finally fell silent in the midst of this lecture in 1882. Even so, that lecture and the series from which it came constitute a meditation on thought, composed during a period when Emerson's own patterns of cognition were undergoing significant change. And so taken within the longer curve of his career, these lectures constitute something significant, not only for those interested in Emerson, but for those interested in the subject of disability and the questions that field poses involving relationships of body and mind. That is to say, a subject Emerson made thematic through his entire career. One thing I want to point out about Natural History of Intellect is that it veers so radically from the dualistic account of body and mind Emerson had placed in the essay that brought him into international prominence, the 1836 essay titled Nature. There, Emerson had proclaimed a more or less absolute division between every self and what Emerson calls not me, the latter category including the natural world as well as our own bodies. The dualism that abstracts the mind from the body derives from religious conceptions of a soul that is similarly separate from the body and its materials. But even in our own day, the notion adheres in conceptions of a consciousness that cannot be reduced to mere tissues, nor even cognitive pathways, a ghost that hovers within the internal cinema, floating at the epicenter of neurological penumbrae. But Emerson made his assertion well prior to the decade during which his own body and mind changed so profoundly and in such concert. And indeed, in the notes to the Harvard lectures he gave in 1870 and 71, he strikes a very different chord. The body is the impediment, he now writes here. The body is the river of Lethe. Its continual flowing and change is the cause of oblivion. We all know better than to demand consistency of Emerson. But his tone of voice changes in the Harvard lecture series, and it changes in a consistent way, abandoning the mind-body opposition of nature for an interest in the extent to which mind and body are implicated in one another, inseparable. Emerson, of course, had no way of knowing what happens to a self, for example, when beta amyloid plaques form on the surface of the brain. And whether he was familiar with the developments in brain science that were underway during the 1870s, which I'd be happy to talk with you about later, if you like, he seems to have taken a somaticist turn as he explains in this lecture that an empirical scientific account of the self seems to him inevitable. I quote. He says, "I believe in the existence of the material world as the expression of the spiritual or the real, and the impenetrable mystery which hides and hides through absolute transparency, the mental nature. I await the insight which our advancing knowledge of material laws shall furnish." Though in the Harvard lecture series, Emerson often seems to opine the ebbing of his own memory, noting in rueful terms that linkage between that and corporeal decline. It's also true that so much of Emerson's thought over the long curve of his career recommends to us various forms of memory loss. I'm thinking, for example, of all the ways Emerson suggests that we break with the past. For example, in the sort of present tense action that characterizes the organic intellectual he describes in The American Scholar. Or to take another, perhaps more signal example, consider the way Emerson thinks about original expression. Surely a topic that has something to do with Cabot's letter to Ellen concerning which Emerson texts were and were not put together by us. Think of Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance, which so often describes the self-reliant thought in terms of a capacity for extemporaneous eloquence. Not long after he urges us in that essay to cease dragging the corpse of our memory, Emerson suggests that rather than harboring what he calls a reverence for our past act or word, we might instead speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though you contradict everything you say today. In one sense, Emerson was always critiquing memory, in this instance drawing an example of how a purposeful act of forgetting what I've said before, for example, precisely in order to free myself to say something new, might generate the circumstances for a new and invigorating kind of speech act. But I think it's also intriguing how that act of deliberate forgetting in a way describes a style of delivery Emerson had cultivated throughout his career as a lecturer, a posture of forgetfulness through which he apparently enacted a certain estrangement from his own texts. George Willis Cook, for example, described an Emerson at the very height of his career, who often copped the appearance on stage of being uncertain what he would say next. Cook describes Emerson's device of trailing off, pausing conspicuously in the midst of sentences, imparting to audiences the sense that they were witnessing an evolving process of thought, when in fact most of his lectures were rote performances, and though in any case they were written on manuscripts in front of him on the table. He hesitates for words, Cook explained, and seems to find it difficult to secure the precise expression he desires. He speaks on the lecture platform much as he converses. Similarly, James Russell Lowell describes Emerson as apparently, but in fact studiedly, searching for words as he performed his lectures. How artfully, he writes, for Emerson is a long-studied artist in these things, does the deliberate utterance that seems to wait for the first word seem to us partners in the labor of thought and make us feel as if the glance of humor were a sudden suggestion, as if the perfect phrase lying written there on the desk were as unexpected to him as to us. So by the time Ellen began joining Emerson at his lectures in order to assist him should he lose his place or forget what he was after, Emerson had long been interested in affecting the extemporaneous, what self-reliance imagines will occur when we stop worrying about consistency, when we stop dragging this corpse of memory. Now that's not to say that later on Emerson wasn't in fact disoriented. As he began to rely upon Ellen further for her help with those fleeting words, in a way, as her intellectual faculties became the prostheses of his sense for the frontiers of individual, self-reliant consciousness would change. But examining this area of Emerson's intellectual biography becomes especially complicated because Emerson's increasing reliance upon Ellen not only blurred for him the conceptual boundaries between me and not me, the axis along which so much of his thought had formed over the course of his career. His editorial relationship with his daughter would also generate a manuscript history in which it is often difficult, if not impossible, to discern whether Emerson is speaking for himself. For instance, throughout much of the 1870s, Ellen either composed his correspondence or, more often, instructed him to copy her words. More than functioning simply as his amanuensis, Ellen's role in her father's life grew increasingly essential in the production of texts, letters, readings, a book, and would envelop distinctions between caretaker, secretary, scribe, editor, and author, precisely inasmuch as they effaced the limits of her voice and his. In one letter to his daughter, undated unfortunately, Emerson waxes wry about this, relaying his explanation to Jane Norton that Ellen was writing his letters, and he says, quote, not to mention all my lectures. A joint letter from Ellen and her father to James Bradley Thayer in July of 1876, part of an effort to ferret out errors that had marred the first edition of the 1875 Letters and Social Aims, tellingly slips between pronouns. Do tell me what we shall do and make us again your debtors. She, he, they write. In fact, as has been pointed out by prior textual editors and biographers of Emerson, Letters and Social Aims was itself compiled from Emerson's lecture notes by Ellen and Cabot, put together by them with Emerson apparently as a passive witness. This was 7 years before the end of Emerson's life, by which point Ellen seems to have assumed an absolute curatorial role. In fact, Letters and Social Aims offers a touchstone here, for this collection, put together by Ellen and Cabot, contains an essay titled Eloquence, also the title of a lecture Emerson had delivered many times since the late 1830s, I believe. In his lecture notes to Eloquence, these lecture notes dated 1847, here's a page from that manuscript, Emerson explains that, quote, Voice is a delicate index of the state of mind, since in finer thought or feeling, the voice attains a music and penetration surprising to the speaker as much as to the auditor. Indeed, Emerson supposes, quote, some orators go to the assembly to find out their own best thoughts. That idea that a speaker's voice can articulate things that are surprising to the speaker herself resonates intriguingly, I think, with the picture Lowell and Cook draw of Emerson acting as if he didn't recall or simply couldn't read his own lecture. For in that instance, what Emerson seems to have been after was a simulation of just this state of surprise, being surprised by one's own words. But interestingly, this sentence is absent from the two renditions of eloquence that Emerson had published himself, appearing neither in the 1858 version of the essay, which he placed in the Atlantic Monthly, nor the 1870 version that appeared in his volume Society and Solitude. In both of those renditions of eloquence, which are almost exactly the same, Emerson represents his subject bullishly, characterizing eloquence as the power to master other people through words. Instead, this sentence appears in the 1875 version of eloquence, which Ellen prepared from these notes for inclusion in Letters and Social Aims. This 1875 version reconceives the essay almost entirely, imagining eloquent oratory as the process of reacquainting oneself with words and thoughts from which one has become detached. And there, in altered form, and for the first time in print, appears the passage from the 1847 manuscript. This old thought that Emerson had discarded from two publications of eloquence, and which Ellen now seems to have retrieved. In moments of clearer thought or deeper sympathy, the voice will attain a music and penetration which surprises the reader as much as the auditor. He also is the sharer of the higher wind that blows over his strings. I believe that some orators go to the assembly as to a closet where to find their best thoughts. So what to make of the sudden inclusion of these lines in the third published rendition of eloquence? Not only a version differing sharply from the first two, but which Emerson's editors today agree was most obviously not under his editorial control. If it is the case that Ellen or Cabot or both are the compositors here, we're left to consider these sentences, initially penned by Emerson in 1847, but then arranged by others in 1875, as now speaking about him, from a vantage point apart from his, a perspective from which Ellen and Cabot would have discerned Emerson's cognitive distance from texts he had written but then forgotten. Or perhaps the retrieval of these lines from Emerson's lecture notes bespeaks a new relevance of which Emerson himself was sensible. Indeed, the sentences resonate with a report Ellen included in a letter to her sister, Edith, in 1874, where she described the pleasure Emerson took in reviewing with her proofs for his poetry collection Parnassus. There she writes, "Father exclaimed yesterday, correcting these proofs is work that pays well. Selections made long ago and forgotten keep rising, each fresh as a star." Part of my point is that there's a dispersal of authorship underway in a text such as Letters and Social Aims, a set of conflations to which Emerson also attends over the course of Natural History of the Intellect. And as I close, I want to point to some of the ways Emerson seems to understand those conflations, even as I problematize all of my claims about this text by offering a word or two about its condition. For if the most crucial of Emersonian motifs, the very first thing we think of in connection with Emerson when we teach him, certainly, is an insistence upon the inviolability of individual consciousness, an absolute division between me and not me that produces the ethical requirement most forcefully put in self-reliance, where the only way I achieve anything like intellectual integrity is to discern where my thought ends and the thought of other people begins. Natural History of the Intellect is striking for its insistence that all thought is collaborative. I do not have enough time tonight to draw out Emerson's argument in its entirety, but I will say that what is most striking to me about this lecture series is Emerson's reimagining of intellectual activity, formerly self-reliant, heroically aloof from external influence, is now dispersed, aggregated, inseparable from the thoughts of other people. Life is incessant parturition, he now tells us. There are viviparous and oviparous minds, minds that produce their thoughts complete men, like armed soldiers, ready and swift to go out and resist and conquer all the armies of error, and others that deposit their dangerous, unripe thoughts here and there, to lie still for a time and be brooded in other minds, and the shell not be broken until the next age, for them to begin as new individuals their career. If some ideas only mature when they're nursed in the consciousness of other thinkers, Emerson's notion of the aviparous mind partakes of a larger natural history, whose tendency is to efface the separations between cognitive processes Emerson figures as parents and their offspring or progeny. The perceptions of a soul, he continues, its wondrous progeny, are born by conversation, the marriage of souls, so nourished, so enlarged. They are detached from their parent. They pass into other minds. Ripened and unfolded by many, they hasten to incarnate themselves in action, to take body, only to carry forward the will which sent them out. In this account, thoughts are detached from a parent, only to gestate elsewhere, ripening and otherwise bearing fruit. Developing further that familial metaphor, Emerson describes the process through which what he calls nimble thoughts animate and alter, and presently are antagonized by other thoughts which they first arouse, or by thoughts which are the sons and daughters of these. Sons and daughters, first aroused by and then antagonizing the parent thoughts, which are really, in some sense, no longer the parents, serve to actualize, to incubate, to parent those parent thoughts. Who has found the boundaries of human intelligence? Emerson thus asks us. By which he seems to mean that those boundaries don't really hold up, that we're all constantly thinking together, remembering together, communing in our ideas and thoughts. It might be just such a notion, in fact, that Ellen Tucker Emerson herself enacts on several manuscript pages of Natural History of the Intellect. To be honest, I've never seen anything quite like this example of several pages from the manuscript that captivated my attention long before I read enough of Ellen's handwriting to realize that those are her own words she's pasting over her father's. She apparently knows better than Emerson what Emerson said at Harvard, or maybe what she thinks he meant or should have meant. And so she's changing things here. And this way of intervening in the text seems to have constituted one example of what it means to put together a text for publication as the 12th and final volume of Cabot's complete works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, when the Harvard Lecture Series was first published. Having read both that version, by the way, and the manuscripts from which it was drawn, I can assure you that the two texts bear a passing resemblance. So here in this final lecture series of his life, the one Emerson thought of as most important, human intelligence is not a self-enclosed thing, not a paragon of individuated consciousness formed most efficiently when we are at remove from one another. It is collaborative, communal, formed at the nexus of multiple sensibilities and perspectives, a product of our interaction, not our withdrawal. I think that there are implications to this way of reading Emerson, whose canonical texts, such as Self-Reliance, which I love, even though I suppose I'm implying it might actually be more idiosyncratic than definitive, may sometimes make him appear suspicious of masses, wary of enjoining social causes, which to me means hostile to democracy. And there are many scholars who have written of Emerson in that way. Whereas self-reliance urges us to go alone, natural history now insists that, quote, to be isolated is to be sick, and insofar dead. But of course, such transformations in Emerson's thought are more difficult for readers to engage if Natural History of Intellect is unavailable. And in that sense, I regret that though Cabot included the text in his complete works, the editors of the newest standard edition, the recently completed collected works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, have left it out, ejecting it from the Emerson canon and therefore recommending implicitly that we simply forget about it. They've got their reasons because the manuscripts are, as they put it, corrupted. And yet, the editorial conventions at play in the decision to omit Natural History of Intellect from the collected works, as articulated by Joseph Slater in his 1971 Statement of Editorial Principles, seeking to establish the text, quote, closest to the author's initial coherent intention. License editors Joel Meyerson and Ron Bosco in their explanation as they completed the collection 40 years later that, quote, we have edited only texts that survive entirely in Emerson's hand, rejecting without notice all emendations in the copy text by Cabot, Ellen Emerson, and Edward Waldo Emerson. Even as they note specifically the problem of Ellen's, what they call intrusion into many of Emerson's manuscripts. Our intention throughout this edition, they explain, is to represent Emerson's, not his executor's, creation of texts. Now, I'm not out to call down editors who have decided to omit what I call Emerson's late style from our collective Emerson, even though I think that this other Emerson, interested in the ways we are all enjoined intellectually, cognitively, recollectively, is in some ways more relevant to the prospects of the experience of democratic communality. You also see in a text like Fortune of the Republic, that lecture that Cabot claims he put together with Ellen. and which for some reason Bosco and Meyerson do include in their new standard edition. On the other hand, every generation of readers has to reinvent an American literature to suit their own purposes. And so I'll end by pointing out two ways forgetting natural history of the intellect closes possibilities, not only concerning our potential use of US intellectual history, but also concerning our understanding of its past. One problem that should seem clear by now is that this foreclosure is part of a more general squeamishness about where Emerson went cognitively but also intellectually late in life. And as such, it prevents us from examining at least one other writer who seems to have had an enormous effect upon the shape of our national literature, Ellen Tucker Emerson. So that's one cost. Another concerns the legacy of what Ellen and Cabot and Emerson put together with this lecture series. Consider, for example, a phrase that seems to have come into this lecture series by way of an earlier lecture titled Perpetual Forces. Emerson later drew upon that lecture as he prepared his notes for Natural History of the Intellect. And by the way, Perpetual Forces also appears on that list. Cabot helpfully used to remind Ellen that they apparently put that one together as well. So he says. It's a phrase that captures the way in which Emerson might say that not only texts but minds themselves are fluid, always mixing up, blending, forming ever-shifting confluences, forming not only what Emerson calls in that earlier quotation I've given you, the river of Lethe, but he also calls elsewhere a stream of thought. Yeah. Composite minds, he writes in the later lecture series, which blend two tendencies or streams of thought, give a rich result, and finally every mind owes it to a new combination of traits, and I've also given you another example of him using that phrase, stream of thought. Now, interestingly, this was 20 years before William James, the pragmatist philosopher and godson of Emerson, would deploy the term in tremendously influential ways in the Principles of Psychology, where the term helps James to ask fundamental questions about how our consciousnesses relate to one another. For instance, why it is that I never accidentally remember someone else's past, or rather, what the differences are between how I might try to do that and how I do so with regard to my own past. When Emerson delivered Natural History of Intellect during the winter and spring of 1870, James was in deep depression, living at the James family home on Brattle Street, literally across the street from Harvard College. Whether James would cross that street to hear his famous godfather speak is an open question, but his copies of both Natural History of Intellect and Perpetual Forces given him by Cabot after Emerson's death are riven with notes. Years later, in Principles, James would inveigh against accounts of consciousness that imagine ideas as discrete entities, packages of thought. That's not what thinking feels like, James argued. Ideas are constantly flowing into one another, mixing together, behaving like a fluid, a stream of thought. There's more to say here, and in a way that's my point, that no other commentator has noticed this particular confluences of the streams of thought we call Ralph Waldo Emerson and William James. Not even Robert Richardson, by the way, who's written lengthy biographies of both figures. Says something about the insistence with which we have been enjoined in the project of forgetting how much Emerson forgot. Of course, that's what Ellen Tucker Emerson wanted. Can't the story be told accurately and well without mentioning me? She wrote to Cabot in 1883 as he was contemplating the biography of Emerson. Let it pass, she insisted. Certainly, Ellen and her father found their own ways of negotiating the interstices of me and not me as they theorized together the terms of their collaboration. Which is to say, very lastly, that corrupted manuscripts like this one are also a provocation for readers. Perhaps where Emerson's memory loss is concerned, to pull yet another one of his phrases from its original place in order to deploy it in my own way. The ruin or the blank is in our own eye. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Would anybody like to ask any questions? Sure. Okay, now remember, this won't help you to be heard, but it'll help them.
Okay. First of all, I wanted to ask Chris, what memory drugs are you taking to deal with that? But that's okay. I mean, we're all getting older, let's face it. Listening to your talk made me think, and I don't know if you've read this, George Saunders' Lincoln at the Bardo, where you have different interpretations of Lincoln's, both his psychology and his physical being, where one person will say, oh, I've never seen such a handsome man, and somebody will say he was the ugliest man I've seen, and it's this continuation of differing opinions, and it made me think about Emerson, and in a wider public sphere, was there word of, oh, this person is losing it, or was this something that was a closely held secret?
That's such a good question, Dava, because, like, as I've mentioned, Ellen Tucker Emerson's words on this subject indicate a desire to kind of keep the cat in the bag, like sort of to protect, as if something like Emerson's reputation is at stake if he fumbles in public or if it gets out. But as I say, there was all kinds of reportage. I mean, journalists were commenting, often, as I say, in a euphemistic way or in a way that seems tortuously constructed in order to affect some form of denial. But that's a great question. It's hard to answer. I mean, part of it probably has to do with the ways memory loss was regarded in the 19th century. Very little understanding of the causes of profound memory loss, that's for sure.
Do you remember when you tried to steal the Buddha in my office?
Stop that.
Chris, I was wondering what scholars like you make of this kind of change in the later Emerson, that kind of merging where the thoughts are perpetual streams together. Yeah. And when I was reading the notes about your presentation, it made me think of Christopher Hitchens, who all his life had this very stance, atheist all the way through, and then to the end when he knew he was dying, there was just this 180 switch, and I never thought I'd see the day, and this kind of change in Emerson. How much do you think is because of his memory loss, that going inside and realizing he needed others, or do we think it was his daughter editing these?
Yeah. That's another great question. Thanks, Denise. I don't know if I can answer that adequately, but I guess what you're making me think I should say is that, like, in some ways, the book it is structured around a series of readings whereby I'm trying to reveal how absolutely critical some woman figure was to the evolution of Emerson's thought. Either Ellen Tucker in sort of not only sort of altering his manuscripts, apparently changing parts of natural history of intellect, but also sort of being enjoined with him in this process that helped him to articulate a different sense of what consciousness is. But his relationship with Margaret Fuller, who sort of challenged him to examine critically his own intellectual coldness and so on. The stakes for me about the kind of Emerson I'm trying to describe is a social Emerson, an Emerson who's interested in collaboration, communality, and interaction. And as I tried to kind of gesture to a little bit in that essay, I sort of agree with Slater's formulation that what we do every generation is we invent a new American literature, and hopefully it's kind of useful to us. And right now I think we need more communality and less sort of high on the mountain sort of disdain for social activism, political processes and so on. And the Emerson I'm interested in re-narrating was someone who was very interested in shaping his socius and sort of moving people, bringing, as he says at one point, it is so delicious to act in concert to such just ends. And and one time, the Emerson Emerson described in scholarship during the first half of the 19th century was utterly disdainful of those things. And there's certainly stuff in Emerson, right, where he expresses disdain for philanthropists, for abolitionists, and so on like that. But then later in his career, after 1850 especially, he just becomes enjoined, and he seems to become energized by the notion of what he calls joining hands with the glowing circle. So that's a rambling answer. I'm sorry, but that's what's at stake for me in rethinking him.
I'm going to come back here to Bonnie. Bonnie?
I just wondered if you could say just a little bit more about Ellen Tucker Emerson. I was interested in her life, her education, sort of what sets her up to be free to be a companion to her father. Does she have literary aspirations? And at first, I will say, I thought this was too stupid of a question to ask. I'll just look it up on my phone, and she doesn't even appear to have a Wikipedia page.
Right? No.
So.
Is that true? Maybe we should start a Wikipedia page. Well, so I'm in the same boat, but I'll tell you a few things about Ellen Tucker Emerson. Unlike Edith, she never married, and that might be the reason she could play this role, or it might be caused by the fact that she played this role. Edith Emerson was off marrying into the Forbes family, and Ellen was at home sort of helping her father, and then accompanying him. She went to England with him after the house burned. She took a trip to Africa with him. She watched him probably more closely than anyone else deteriorate. She did have literary aspirations. She wrote a memoir, and this is another, I tried to work with this because I think it's so interesting. There are all these memoirs being written by people about other people in the 19th century. Like, we think of memoir as something that you do, it's autobiography. I'm remembering myself, but they remembered for others, and I think that has a ring to it, something like what I'm interested in here. But she wrote a memoir of her mother, Lydia Jackson Emerson. Very beautiful manuscript. She does some interesting kind of scrapbooking there, like the manuscripts. At one point she says, I desire to pin here a fragment, a swatch from her favorite dress, and then she does. She pins this little swatch in there. Kind of a religious fundamentalist later in life, kind of not very interested in the women's movement, disappointingly, which some scholars have suggested to me makes it more interesting in some ways. But yeah, no, this person who really took on the cause of what Emerson scholars now refer to as the Emerson industry, right? Sort of caretaking his image and sort of figuring out after his death how he's to be institutionalized and remembered at a mass level. But there should be a Wikipedia page at the very least, and probably a biography. Right. Yeah. Thank you. This is the old story, right? This is the old story, right? There are all these women connected with these important male writers who get recognized much later or not at all. I mean, I was just at Dove Cottage this summer, and they did this great thing on the Wordsworths and the extent to which there's no way, right? William Wordsworth would have put out what he did if it weren't for his sister. In Emerson's case,
thinking of another question, I would also mention that Dagny Bredesen and Newton Key will be hosting a reception afterwards. You have, Melissa Ames here has the way to go, how to get there.
Can I just shout this question?
I don't know.
Yes, I could shout it. Really? Okay.
There are dozens of people watching online right now.
Oh. That's right. Well, I'll identify myself. I'm Randy Beebe.
Dan Ringat, Chair of the Department of English.
No. Yeah, I'm wondering what then, I mean, you bring up such a great point about what Bosco and Meyerson have left out of the collected works. What has been the scholarly or critical or academic response to what they've left out? Has there been a brouhaha, or has it just been left alone?
I'm really glad you asked that, because the first thing any Emerson scholar should say to Joel Meyerson and Ronald Bosco is thank you, because they've edited more of Emerson's words than anyone. And you know, for someone like me to sort of challenge their decisions would be absurd in some ways. But I'm interested in the implications and what they suggest concerning the subject matter of that particular essay. Now, with Natural History of Intellect, I should mention Bosco and Meyerson published a textual introduction to the last volume of the collected works, which is a book in itself. And it's about their editorial decisions. It's about the condition of the manuscripts, and they sort of get into the details here. They're not Ronald Bosco and Joel Meyerson are not a part of the problem of Emerson scholars who cannot bring themselves to face that Emerson suffered memory loss. But that said, you know, there are other important works by Emerson that fall into the category that troubles that sort of initial vision that, well, we're only going to publish works that are by Emerson and by Emerson alone and according to his original coherent intentions. Emerson collaborated with two other writers, we talked about this afternoon, on a memoir of Margaret Fuller Asoli. Well, that's not in the collected works. I think you can make an argument that there should be, that should be there. Other works that are corrupted don't appear. When the original collected works project was initiated, I think in 1971, the original editors projected some kind of overflow volumes, like early lectures, late lectures, places where a lot of the lecture materials could appear, but they didn't use that to publish Natural History of Intellect either. So I think it's just this problematic thorn in the side sort of text that a lot of modern editors kind of wish never was written, because it presents all these problems. But no brouhaha, nor do I want one. Yeah. Yeah.
Shall we give Christopher Hanlon a round of applause?
Thanks.